name is Rachel, and my life has always felt a little off. Growing up, I never really understood the dynamics of my family. I'd always been aware of my parents' favoritism toward my younger brother, Tommy. They never really hid it. He was their golden child, the heir to the family business, and the one they lavished attention on. Meanwhile, I was often treated as an afterthought, especially when it came to anything remotely related to the family store. Our family owned a successful business, a tableware store, but the real backbone of the store was my grandmother, and everyone knew it. Sure, my parents ran it, but it was Grandma who had built it from the ground up. She was the one who made it what it was today. I loved spending time with her, especially on weekends when I would go over to her house. She would teach me business strategies, how to manage inventory, how to calculate profit margins, how to negotiate with suppliers. Grandma would set up a little business game on the table, and we'd act out scenarios. She was the one who noticed that I had a head for numbers and business from a young age. I always found these games with Grandma much more exciting than anything happening at home. At home, my parents were busy grooming Tommy to inherit the store, as if nothing else mattered. Meanwhile, I excelled in school, acing my classes, while Tommy barely managed to get through without much effort. He was often the center of attention, the one getting all the praise, while I was the one who quietly kept my head down, working hard but getting no recognition for it. When I was 14, my world changed. I still remember the day clearly. It was just after dinner, and my parents called me into the living room. My father's stern face told me that something serious was coming. "Rachel," he began, his voice cold, "you're going to start helping out with the store after school from now on." My first thought was that it was some kind of joke. I had been helping out for years, but this was different. I could tell they had other plans for me. Tommy. He wasn't expected to lift a finger. Instead, he would lounge around, playing video games and doing nothing productive, while I was suddenly expected to work at the store every day after school. At first, I didn't mind too much. I worked hard, trying to prove myself, wanting to show that I was as capable as they thought Tommy was. I mopped floors, cleaned shelves, arranged the display tables, and worked with customers. I worked late some nights, staying in the store long after the employees had gone home, just to make sure everything was perfect. But over time, something started bothering me. Every Friday, the employees would receive their paychecks. They would talk about what they were going to do with their earnings, their weekend plans. Meanwhile, I worked just as hard, if not harder, but got nothing in return. I was still a child in their eyes, so they justified it as a free place to live and food on the table. One night, when I couldn't take it anymore, I gathered all my courage and approached my parents. I asked them why I wasn't getting paid. I worked just as hard as everyone else, and it seemed unfair that they didn't recognize that. I'll never forget my father's reaction. He scoffed at me, as though I had asked something ridiculous. "Do you have any idea how much we spend on you?" he snapped. "Food, clothes, the roof over your head? Do you think all that's free?" I tried to argue, tried to explain that it wasn't the same, but my mother cut me off with a harsh reply. "Consider your work here as payment for everything we provide for you." Many children would be grateful for such an arrangement. That was the moment I realized that they would never treat me the same as they treated Tommy. They weren't seeing me as someone who deserved a chance to earn her own money. I was just a tool for them to use in their store, and I didn't have a voice. They controlled everything, and if I dared to complain, I would face their wrath. It was only a few months after this conversation that my 16th birthday came around, and with it, a decision I knew I had to make. I was tired of being treated like I didn't matter. I had big dreams, and I couldn't let my parents hold me back anymore. So, I made up my mind to quit. I wasn't going to be their unpaid worker anymore. The day after my birthday, I walked into my parents' office, head held high, and told them that I was quitting. Their faces, especially my father's, were a mixture of disbelief and anger. They couldn't understand why I would want to leave the family business, but I wasn't asking for their approval anymore. I had plans. I had the opportunity to work at a local cafe, and I was going to take it. That was when everything started to change. I walked out of that office, the weight of years of resentment lifting off my shoulders. I felt free. Working at the cafe was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I felt appreciated. I worked part-time after school, and every Friday, I got my paycheck. I earned my own money. I bought myself new clothes, a new phone, and, most importantly, I could buy small gifts for my grandmother without feeling guilty. This was the start of a new chapter in my life, and I felt more alive than I had in years. But even though I was starting to build a life for myself, there were still things I had to hide from my family. I lied to Grandma about still working at the store because I knew my parents wouldn't approve. They didn't know what it was like to work hard for something and get rewarded for it. They still didn't understand me, but I was starting to understand myself. After I quit the family store and started working at the Coffee Corner Cafe, I felt like I had stepped into a whole new world. For the first time, I was earning my own money, making decisions for myself, and seeing the fruits of my labor. It was exhilarating. Sarah, my manager, was a godsend. She was kind, patient, and actually saw me for who I was, a hardworking, ambitious young woman, rather than just an extension of her business or an obligation to fill. The first time I received my paycheck from the cafe, I couldn't stop smiling. It wasn't a lot, but it was mine. I didn't have to ask for anything or be treated like a child just because I was living at home. I could buy my own clothes, treat myself to things that I liked, and for the first time, I could buy small gifts for my grandma. She was always there for me, and I wanted to show her how much I appreciated her. The next few months flew by. I had found my rhythm at the cafe, balancing my shifts with schoolwork and keeping my family's expectations at bay. My grades stayed strong, and the comments from my teachers about college were starting to feel real. It wasn't a matter of if I was going to college anymore. It was where I would go. But there was always the constant reminder that my parents' views of me hadn't changed. My mother, especially, continued to treat me like I was just a burden in the house. She never missed an opportunity to remind me that I wasn't pulling my weight, despite the fact that I was now supporting myself. She never let go of the idea that Tommy, who did nothing to contribute, was the one who mattered. It was like a thorn in my side that I couldn't pull out. As senior year approached, I knew I had to take the next step. I had applied to City College and had my heart set on it. The college had a great business program, and they offered full scholarships to students with my academic record. I spent countless nights crafting the perfect application, putting everything I had into it. I knew my parents wouldn't help with tuition. They had made that clear over the years. But I didn't care. I was going to make this happen on my own, and then came the day I had been waiting for, the acceptance letter. It came with a scholarship offer that covered everything. I felt like I was on top of the world. This was it. This was the future I had worked so hard for. The day of my graduation dinner, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I had to tell my parents. I had spent so many years hiding my achievements, pretending to be less than I was just to avoid conflict, but not anymore. It was time for them to see me for who I had become, not just their daughter, but a young woman with a future. I've enrolled in City College's business program, I said, trying to sound casual, my heart racing. Full scholarship. The silence at the table was suffocating. My father's expression was unreadable, but I could see the gears turning in his head. Then, finally, he smiled. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, that's certainly convenient," he said, exchanging a look with my mother. "Yes, we won't have to worry about tuition," my mother added, as if I had just solved their financial problems with a simple announcement. I should have expected it. I shouldn't have been surprised. But the next words out of my father's mouth hit me like a ton of bricks. "Now that you're an adult," he began, "we need to discuss your living arrangements." "Living arrangements?" I echoed, trying to process what he was saying. "Rent?" he said flatly, looking at me with no emotion. "Starting today, you'll need to pay rent to continue living here." I thought I heard him wrong. "What? You're serious, right? I'm your daughter." I could feel the anger bubbling inside me. "You can't be serious." My mother's tone was cold as she added, "We're no longer legally obligated to support you. This house belongs to us, and if you want to stay, you'll need to pay your fair share." I looked at my brother Tommy, who was oddly silent. Would he have to pay rent too when he turned 18? Of course not. The thought of it was laughable. He was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one who didn't have to earn anything. It was always me who had to prove myself. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to keep calm. "This is my home too," I said, my voice shaking with disbelief. "I shouldn't have to pay rent. I've been doing everything for this family." But my mother just laughed, her mask of civility finally slipping. "This is our house," she snapped. "And if you won't pay rent, you need to leave tonight." It hit me like a slap to the face. My own parents were throwing me out on graduation night, the one night that should have been a celebration of everything I had worked for. And instead, it was the night they decided to throw me away. "Tonight?" I whispered, feeling my stomach drop. "You're kicking me out tonight?" "Yes," my father said, his voice steady, like it was just another chore on his to-do list. "You have an hour to pack your things." I couldn't believe it. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. My parents were actually doing this. They were throwing their own daughter out without so much as a second thought. I ran upstairs, my hands shaking as I packed whatever I could. The tears came, but I wiped them away quickly. There was no time for crying, no time for feeling sorry for myself. I had to leave. There was no other choice. I thought about calling Grandma. She would help me. But then I remembered that she had just left for her trip to Hawaii. She wouldn't be back for 3 weeks. I couldn't ruin her vacation with my drama. She deserved better than that. With no other options, I called Jenny, a friend of mine from middle school. Her family had always been kind to me. I knew I could rely on her. Within 20 minutes, Jenny was at my house, ready to help me pack up and leave. As I left my home behind, I glanced back. My parents were standing at the window watching me leave. They showed no emotion, no regret. At that moment, I finally understood. They had never really loved me. Not the way they loved Tommy. Not the way I had always hoped. Jenny drove me to her house, and as I sat in the passenger seat, I felt a strange calm wash over me. It was like a chapter of my life had finally ended. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing. I was finally free. By the time I reached my senior year, everything felt different. I had managed to carve out a small piece of peace, but I wasn't blind to the tension that still existed at home. I had been pushing hard to keep up with school, work, and the ongoing stress from my parents, but I had learned to adapt. At least I tried. It was during this time that my parents' behavior toward me reached a new low. It wasn't just about the work at the store anymore. The financial burden that they had been placing on me had been escalating. They had always treated me like an afterthought, a second-rate member of the family. Tommy, of course, was their golden child, their investment in the store, and their hopes for the future. Meanwhile, I was their unpaid labor, expected to contribute without question and without reward. In fact, during one of our dinners, I overheard something that made my stomach churn. My parents were talking about money again, but this time, it was about my future. "Rachel's college fund," I heard my mother say, her voice low but unmistakable. "We could use that for Emma's tuition instead. Get her into that private high school she wants. It would be a better investment in the long run." I stopped in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my heart sink. Emma was my younger sister, and while she had her own ambitions, they were nothing like mine. I had spent years working hard, excelling in school, and building a future for myself. And now they were considering using my savings, the one thing they had promised me, to pay for Emma's education? My father's voice was weak when he responded. "I promised Sarah I'd make sure Rachel got an education," he said. "I can't just take her money." But then my mother countered, "You can't keep letting your promises to a dead woman control our lives forever. Rachel's old enough now to take care of herself. We need to focus on Emma." It was like a punch to the gut. The very people who were supposed to support me were using my future as a bargaining chip. They weren't even seeing me as an individual anymore. They were treating me like an obligation. I realized that all these years, I'd been nothing more than a pawn in their plans for the family business. When I came home later that night, I tried to push those thoughts aside, but they lingered, gnawing at me. I needed a way out, something that wasn't tied to my parents. I had to rely on myself, not them. But there was a nagging voice inside me, one that kept whispering that I wouldn't make it without them. My grandparents had always been there for me, but they were getting older, and I didn't want to be a burden to them either. At my graduation dinner, just before the final bombshell dropped, I was feeling a mix of anticipation and dread. I had made it this far. I had been accepted into City College with a full scholarship, and I was ready to start the next chapter of my life. But I was about to face the harsh reality that my parents had already planned my future, one that didn't include my dreams. As we sat at the dinner table, I casually mentioned my college plans, hoping that they would at least pretend to be proud of me. I told them about the full scholarship to the business program, my future, and my hopes for becoming successful in my own right. What happened next was a gut punch. My father, looking pleased with himself, responded with a cold smile. "That's certainly convenient," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "At least we won't have to worry about tuition anymore." I felt my chest tighten, but I couldn't let them see how much their words hurt me. I was used to this after all, but then came the part that truly broke me. "Now that you're finished with high school," my mother said, "we need to talk about your living arrangements." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "Rent," my father said flatly, his eyes not even meeting mine. "Starting today, you'll need to pay rent if you want to keep living here." I laughed at first, thinking they were joking, but their faces remained cold and serious. My laugh died in my throat. I looked at my younger brother, Tommy, expecting him to speak up or at least offer some defense, but he said nothing. Of course, Tommy wouldn't have to pay rent. He was their precious son, the one who would inherit the family business. I tried to argue. "But I'm your daughter. I have a right to live here." "Not anymore," my mother snapped. "You're an adult now, Rachel. You need to pay your fair share." I felt my entire world start to crumble. I was shaking now, my voice rising as I tried to make sense of the words coming out of their mouths. "What about Tommy? Will he have to pay rent when he turns 18? Their silence said it all. Tommy would never have to do anything like that. It was always different for him. "You have 1 hour," my father said, cutting through my thoughts. "Pack your things and get out." It was as if the world tilted beneath me. My body went numb. I ran upstairs in a daze, my mind spinning. Tears blurred my vision as I packed the few things I could carry: clothes, some of my books, and my laptop. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely zip up the bags. My first thought was to call Grandma, but she was on her annual trip to Hawaii. I couldn't ruin her vacation. She deserved better than this. So, with nowhere else to turn, I called Jenny, my best friend. Her family had always been kind to me, and when she answered, she didn't even hesitate. She was at my house within minutes, ready to help me escape my parents' cruelty. As we drove away from my childhood home, I caught a glimpse of my parents standing in the window, watching me leave. No emotions, no regret, just cold indifference. It felt like a punch to the gut. I had never truly mattered to them. That night, as I settled into Jenny's fold-out couch, I realized something important. I was free. I was no longer under their control. But it also meant I had lost everything: my family, my home, my past. I had to start over, completely alone. By the time I reached my senior year of high school, things had reached a boiling point. I was exhausted from living in a house where I was constantly reminded that I was a second-class citizen compared to Tommy. It wasn't just that I worked harder and received nothing in return. It was the way I was treated by my parents. It was as if I was invisible, as if the only thing that mattered was Tommy and his future. I threw myself into my schoolwork, focusing on my grades, hoping that maybe, just maybe, things would be different once I graduated. My teachers recognized my efforts and often told me I could go anywhere, that my grades were exceptional enough to earn me a spot at some of the best colleges in the country: Harvard, Yale, Stanford. Those were the names they mentioned. But deep down, I knew that my parents wouldn't help me with tuition. They had made that clear over the years. What hurt even more was that they didn't just ignore me when it came to college. They ignored me in everything else. I had worked at the family store since I was 14, without pay, sacrificing my time and energy, only to be treated like an afterthought. The money I had earned was spent elsewhere, and when I looked at my parents, I saw two people who no longer cared about me, only about their store and their future. And then there was Tommy, the golden child who could do no wrong. He didn't have to do any real work. He didn't have to deal with the constant pressure of being the one who always had to prove herself. But he got everything. Everything in my life felt like a balancing act, and the foundation was starting to crack. I had kept quiet for so long, believing that things would get better, that somehow my hard work and sacrifice would be recognized. But when I overheard my parents talking about my college fund, about how they would rather use the money for Tommy's education instead of mine, I knew that was it. I had been nothing more than an obligation to them, a source of free labor. I stood in the hallway, listening to their conversation, feeling my heart sink with every word. They didn't care about me, not in the way parents should care about their children. I wasn't their priority. Tommy was. Tommy would always be their priority. That night, I decided to take action. I couldn't keep living this way, being treated like a second-class citizen in my own home. So I did what I knew would make a difference. I sat down at my desk, wrote out my resignation letter, and handed it to them the next morning. I told them I was done. I wasn't working for free anymore. I had found a job at the local cafe, and I was going to earn my own money for once. Their reaction was swift and cold. My father barely looked up from his paperwork when I handed him the letter. "Fine," he said, dismissing me as if I were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "But you'll still have to work here after school. You owe us, Rachel. You can't just walk away from this." That was when I realized that no matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I gave, I would never be enough for them. I had been working for free, sacrificing my time, my energy, my youth, everything, for a family who didn't appreciate me, and now they were trying to guilt-trip me into staying, into continuing to work for them without pay. But I was done. I walked out of the house that day, feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I wasn't tied to the weight of their expectations, their demands, their lies. I was free to make my own choices, free to decide what was best for me. And so, I took the job at the cafe and began building my life on my terms. The first paycheck I received from the cafe was the most empowering feeling I'd ever experienced. It was mine. No one else had control over it. No one else could decide how it was spent. It was my hard work, my effort, and I earned every penny. I was finally doing something for myself, something that made me feel proud, but things at home only got worse. As I worked my shifts at the cafe, I knew my parents weren't happy with my decision. They made it clear that they thought I was making a mistake. They didn't understand why I wouldn't just accept the situation, why I couldn't just be satisfied with the free ride they were giving me, but they didn't understand what it meant to feel worthless, to feel like you were nothing more than a tool to them. It wasn't just about the money. It was about respect. It was about the years of being ignored, of being treated like an outsider in my own family. I was tired of playing their game. I didn't want to be their unpaid worker anymore. I didn't want to keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. And then came graduation day. I had been waiting for this moment for years, the day I would finally be free from the confines of my parents' expectations. I had my diploma in hand, a scholarship to City College, and the promise of a future that didn't involve my parents. But when I shared the news with them at dinner, their reaction wasn't the pride I had expected. Instead, my father's face twisted into a calculating smile. "Well, that's convenient," he said, looking at my mother. "No need to worry about tuition anymore." I didn't understand. I had just earned a full scholarship, a full ride to college, and they were treating it like it was nothing. But then they dropped the bombshell. "Now that you're an adult," my mother said, "you'll need to start paying rent." I laughed, thinking it was some kind of joke, but the look on their faces told me otherwise. They were serious. They wanted me to pay rent to live in the house I had grown up in, the house that was mine by birthright. It didn't make sense. Tommy didn't have to pay rent. Tommy didn't have to worry about anything. I tried to argue. I tried to explain that I was their daughter, that I shouldn't have to pay rent, but they didn't care. They saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience, a burden that they were tired of carrying. And then, as if it was nothing, they told me to leave. That night, I packed my things in a daze, my hands shaking as I tried to zip up my suitcase. I had no idea where I was going to go. My first thought was Grandma, but she was out of town on vacation. I couldn't reach her. So, I turned to my friend Jenny, who had always been kind to me. I called her, and within minutes, she came to pick me up. I was out of my parents' house for good, and I was never going back. But the pain of their betrayal didn't end there. The next week, my parents went on social media and posted a message claiming that I had run away and stolen money from the family store. They tried to ruin my reputation, to make me the villain in a story that wasn't even true, but I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I fought back, and the truth came out. The lies they had been telling caught up with them, and the family business that had once been theirs was taken from them. In the end, it wasn't just the store that changed, it was my life. I had earned something no one could take away, my independence. In this part, Rachel finally takes control of her life and stands up to her parents, quitting her unpaid labor at the family store and starting her own path. She's forced to leave her home, but finds a sense of freedom and independence as she begins building her future. The betrayal and lies from her parents reach their breaking point, and Rachel refuses to be treated as a tool any longer. The days that followed the family meeting were surreal. My parents, once so confident and sure of their control over everything, were now humbled, scrambling to sell off their possessions and cover up the massive debt they had incurred. I could feel the weight lifting from my shoulders, but I didn't feel victorious. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my future. Grandma wasted no time making the necessary changes. She appointed a new manager to oversee the store, someone who actually cared about the business and its customers. Mark Davidson, the temporary manager, was knowledgeable, trustworthy, and, most importantly, he had ethics. It was clear that Grandma wasn't going to let my parents back in the store or the family business, and honestly, I couldn't have been more relieved. The business was finally going to be run with integrity, and I was going to be part of that. I still remember the day Grandma sat me down and handed me the official papers. She'd spoken to her lawyer, and the store was now officially mine. This store was always meant for someone who understands both business and ethics, she said, her voice firm but loving. And that someone is you, Rachel. It was the moment I'd been waiting for. I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders, but it was a weight I was more than willing to bear. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about my identity, my purpose. The first thing I did was send a message to my parents, telling them that the store and the house were now under my name, that they were no longer part of the family business. I didn't ask for their opinion, nor did I expect any apologies. They had made their choices, and now they had to live with the consequences. Tommy, on the other hand, was a different story. He wasn't fully responsible for their actions. In the aftermath of everything, he reached out to me. "I'm sorry for everything," he said over the phone, his voice sincere. "I didn't see it back then, but I see it now. I was entitled, and I didn't realize how much you were hurt." It was a rare moment of clarity from him, and I appreciated it more than I could express. We had a lot to work through, but for the first time, we were on the same side. Grandma's support never wavered. She had always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. "You have what it takes," she would say, always reminding me of my worth and potential. As I sat beside her in her living room, discussing future plans for the store, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. We had both come a long way, but there were still moments of uncertainty, especially when it came to my parents. They continued to reach out, sending me birthday cards and messages about forgiveness, but I knew better now. I had learned the hard way that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. The guilt that had haunted me for years, the feeling of being unworthy, was finally gone. They didn't get to dictate my worth anymore. I was the one who decided who I was. In those moments of silence, when I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized something important. Life has taught me the most valuable lesson I could ever learn: the power of choice. My parents thought they were punishing me, trying to break me, but in reality, they had given me the greatest gift: freedom. They had forced me to step into my own power, to take charge of my future, and to never settle for less than I deserved. I decided to focus on the future. Graduation was coming up, and I was determined to graduate with honors. My business degree was within reach, and my dreams of running the store my grandmother had built were becoming a reality. But more than that, I wanted to build something of my own, something that wasn't tainted by the dysfunction of my past. When I walked across that stage at graduation, it wasn't just for me. It was for Grandma, for every moment of struggle, and for every ounce of strength I had to find within myself. I had made it, and I knew I had the tools to succeed in ways my parents never would have allowed. I spent the next few months focusing on rebuilding. The store was doing well under new management, and I was actively involved in the process of modernizing it while preserving the integrity Grandma had instilled in it. My work ethic had paid off, and I could see the fruits of my labor slowly starting to bear fruit. As I continued my journey toward making the store my own, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held. There were still a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of healing to be done. But one thing was certain: I was no longer the scared, invisible girl who had once been overlooked. I was Rachel, and I was going to build my future with my own two hands. And as for my parents, I don't know if they will ever understand the damage they caused. I don't know if they'll ever truly apologize or change, but I don't need their approval anymore. I've built a life for myself, one that's free from their control and their lies. And that, to me, is more than enough. The future was mine to create. As I sat in my grandmother's cozy living room, the reality of everything that had happened settled in. My parents' lies, their manipulation, and their ultimate betrayal. It was all finally coming to light. But now, I am free. I didn't need them anymore. Grandma was a steady force throughout everything. She had always believed in me, even when my own parents didn't. The store, which had once felt like a prison to me, was now a symbol of my freedom. It was mine, by merit, not birthright. Tommy, too, had changed. Without the weight of our parents' manipulation, he started to see things more clearly. We began talking, truly talking for the first time. I realized that, despite everything, he wasn't entirely to blame. He was just as much a victim of our parents' games as I had been. Things moved quickly after that. My parents had no choice but to sell their cars and their vacation home and take out loans to pay back what they had stolen. They were left with nothing, just as they had left me with nothing when they kicked me out. But unlike them, I had found a new sense of self-worth. The family business, which I had been working towards my whole life, was now truly mine. Grandma was there to help me every step of the way, teaching me how to run the store, how to make it thrive, and how to balance the books. More importantly, she was teaching me how to keep my integrity intact, something my parents had never understood. In the end, I had learned everything I needed from my parents' cruelty. They had tried to break me, but instead, they forged a strength in me that would never be taken away. My journey wasn't just about proving myself to them. It was about proving to myself that I was worthy of success, no matter where I came from. Now, I was building a life on my own terms, one where I wasn't hiding in anyone's shadow, and that nothing could ever take from me.